I started off the year by attempting to work my way through all of Luis Bunuel's filmography, to tick off the films I hadn't seen yet. I got as far as rewatching the surrealist masterwork of Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or, the curious but problematic Land Without Bread, and a first-time watch of his first Mexican work, Gran Casino, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Before I could delve further though, I was met with the sad news of the death of David Lynch, and immediately changed my viewing priorities. Losing David Lynch this year was a massive blow to the world of cinema. I watched nothing but Lynch for weeks following the news of his passing. I watched pretty much his entire filmography, including a first-time watch of his overlooked short The Cowboy and the Frenchman, which was brilliant and hilarious with a magnificent performance by Harry Dean Stanton, as well as a very, very long overdue rewatch a little later in the year of the original run of Twin Peaks for the first time in well over a decade. For my money, it's still the greatest thing ever made for television. Later still, towards the end of the year, I rewatched Twin Peaks The Return for the first time in about 8 years. I remembered thinking it was not a masterpiece when I first binged through it in under a week. This time around, I think some of its indulgences didn't quite work as effectively on me, but it still had its fair share of sublime moments, with Lynch and Frost proving to be the undisputed champions of avant-garde television drama. I also found time to work my way through the book Room to Dream. It's kind of split into alternating chapters, where Christine McKenna goes through the life of David Lynch in biographical format, and Lynch then responds to each chapter in turn, giving his own thoughts and views and anecdotes. It's a really interesting and experimental way to deliver a biography, and it's just a really beautiful, intimate, and brilliant portrait. If you only ever read one book on Lynch, check this out. I managed to finish off my Gregg Araki filmography, thanks to his very elusive second feature, The Long Weekend, finally appearing on the internet. Early Araki films are always a joy thanks to their surreal blending of anarchic vibes and overly dramatic levels of teenage angst. The Living End and his Teenage Apocalypse trilogy, which I picked up the fantastic Criterion edition of earlier this year, serve to perfectly encapsulate this. But there's something quite intriguing about his more lo-fi art house black and white student films before these. The Long Weekend was great to watch as that final missing piece of the Araki puzzle, and it would be fantastic to see this and Three Bewildered People in the Night get a proper remaster at some point. I'll be sure to compile some thoughts on Araki for a future video down the line, now that I've seen them all. Speaking of elusive works, I'd really given up any hope of seeing much more Ken Russell stuff anytime soon, so I was ecstatic to see 7 of his 60s BBC works that I had previously never seen crop up in various bootleg, time-coded VHS sources. Amongst these works were his films on Bartok and Prokofiev, which have been works that I've been wanting to see for a long time. They are both important works for Russell that show the gradual evolution of how he pushed against the stoic boundaries of the BBC in his creative portrayal of his subjects. After being allowed to use actors in long shot only and non-speaking roles in Elgar, Bartok shows the first time that an actor was allowed to play a subject in close-up, albeit still not speaking. Aside from that fact, Bartok was also a fantastic work, right up there with the best of his BBC works and its creative visual storytelling entwined with its classical subject matter. Amongst the others that have surfaced are his film on variations of mechanical theme, Lotte Lenya, The Light Fantastic and The Preservation Man. I've watched all but the Lotte Lenya ones so far and really enjoyed them. In spite of the rather poor quality, they're all equally entrancing works, and are probably more important than ever now as a time capsule of people and places that just no longer exist. On top of all these early BBC works, one of his most obscure and confoundingly strange latter-era TV works finally surfaced also, Alice in Russia Land. The rip is of an umpteenth generation VHS tape recorded off a foreign broadcast with hard-coded subtitles and a watermark in the corner, is missing the first 5 minutes, and generally looks like a bit of a smeary mess. But hey, better than nothing. It was a much better work than I was expecting too. Russell uses the Alice in Wonderland framework to give us a brief overview of Russian history before diving headlong into some of its more obscure art and music. A small section of the first half even moonlights as a bit of an irreverent Shostakovich biopic. Discoveries like these and people's drive to preserve them really do highlight the importance and magnificence of internet preservation, especially as you don't see the BBC or ITV or Channel 4 doing a whole lot to actually make some of these works visible again. If any more stuff surfaces in the next year, I may consider revisiting and re-editing my Ken Russell series into a more definitive documentary as we approach the centenary of the director's birth. So, watch this space. I had a bit of a Derek Jarman binge in December too. Jarman was one of those directors whose work and ideas I admire a hell of a lot, but whose films as a whole never fully clicked with me. I had them all on DVD and watched all but 2 of them well over a decade ago. I picked up the 2 BFI Blu-ray sets before they started going for ludicrous money a few years back, and finally felt like delving into them. I don't know if it was down to the Blu-ray presentations or just simply the fact that I knew what to expect from his films now, or a combination, but I liked them a whole lot more this time around. He was one of Britain's truest filmic artists. Revisiting later experimental works like The Last of England and The Garden, I felt like I was seeing the films again from a newer perspective. I resonated with just how anarchic and fucking angry they are, as well as how ethereal his use of Super 8 and videotape was, combined with a haunting sound design. The last 15 minutes of The Last of England are so dreamy, and moments of The Garden border on nightmarish avant-garde horror cinema at times. I enjoyed Jubilee a lot more this time around too. It's such a brilliantly edited piece of punk dystopia.
Our school motto was Faites vos désirs reality. Make your desires reality. I myself preferred the song Don't Dream It, Be It.
I also finally watched the two features that I'd yet to see, with the mesmerising and thoroughly moving War Requiem, which blended the operatic suite of Benjamin Britten with the prose of Wilfred Owen, filtered through Jarman's own enigmatic visual intuition. The film comprises 35mm filmed narrative sections spiked with Super 8 experimentation and archival film and video footage from 20th century warfare. It all culminates into some incredibly powerful moments that juxtapose the British tendencies towards romanticism of the past with some utterly harrowing and striking footage of real war and death. Edward II was another surprise, which was deliciously and defiantly anachronistic, even more so than his most famous work, Caravaggio. It's simultaneously the most straightforward of his later films, whilst also being one of his most playfully experimental. The performances are great, and I love the minimalistic but moody set design. Not sure why I never got around to watching this whilst discovering his films a decade ago, but I'm glad that I've rectified that now. I watched through the filmography of Maya Deren also, whose Meshes of the Afternoon had previously been the only film of hers I'd seen, a milestone in avant-garde American cinema that was definitely one of the sources of inspiration for David Lynch. As expected, the rest of her body of work turned out to be an incredibly interesting mix of surrealism, documentary, and a fascination with the human form through dance and ritual. She's someone whose life sounds very interesting too. I'd love to read more about her in the not too distant future. I filled a couple more gaps in Karel Zeman's filmography too, with The Stolen Airship and The Treasure of Bird Island. In The Stolen Airship, a loose adaptation of a Jules Verne tale, Zeman once again uses every cinematic trick in the book to craft a visually exciting and wholly original blend of live action, cut-out animation, stop motion, and expressionistic set design, in a film that's filled with humour, charm, and surreal imagination. This might just be one of my favourites on a first-time watch alone. The Treasure of Bird Island, on the other hand, is one of his only feature-length works to be entirely crafted out of stop-motion puppets like his earliest shorts. Unfortunately, the film itself is quite hard to track down on any sort of DVD, let alone one with English subtitles, so I had to watch it in a very subpar YouTube rip with some fan-translated subtitles of dubious quality attached and synced up. I got the gist of the film, but it was a bit of a smeary mess. I felt like a lot of the charm and craftsmanship that I so admired from his early shorts felt a bit lost in translation to me here. I'd happily give it another go if a proper release came along, or even a better quality rip came along, but for now I'm just happy to say that I've at least ticked it off the list. As you may be aware from my last video, a review of the Radical Japan box set from Radiance, I watched a ton of Nagisa Oshima films, with both Boy and The Ceremony being first-time watches for me. My thoughts on those and others can be found in that video. As well as these, I also discovered a few other directors through first-time watches. Most notably, Jeff Keen. Jeff Keen was a name that I remember seeing several years back when I moved to Brighton. I was big into experimental filmmakers, but usually favoured European and Asian ones. I'd kind of just dismissed British ones, thinking they couldn't be wild or crazy enough. What a foolish assessment that was. My uncle tipped me off to a screening with a live musical accompaniment to some of his films happening at Brighton University, so I seized the opportunity to grab the last, very underpriced second-hand copy of the BFI's very much out-of-print Blu-ray collection of Jeff Keen's works from CEX. I watched through most of the first disc featuring his most famous works like Cineblat's, Marvo Movie and Metadays, as well as a Channel 4 commissioned portrait called Jeff Keen Films. I was bowled over by the spontaneous creativity, the punk vibes, the playful and decidedly unpretentious approach to his process. It was like a drugged-up fusion of Kenneth Anger, Derek Jarman and Jan Svankmajer. I think he might quickly become one of my favourite experimental filmmakers on these watches alone. The screening itself was also spectacular. The improvised jazz musical accompaniment to a selection of Keen's film and video work really heightened their power further. I look forward to devouring the rest of his works throughout 2026. Sabin Balasa is a Romanian painter and animator from the 60s and 70s, whose work just popped up out of the blue one day on my YouTube feed, and I'm so glad it did. The 9 films of his that I've seen are all on YouTube and are all entrancing works of art. The term moving painting is often used to describe cinematic works of art, but these films literally are moving paintings. The transitional nature of the abstract characters and environments being constantly painted and repainted from frame to frame created such a unique, dreamy vibe to the animation. Scenes almost melt into each other in such a unique way. They reminded me of the works of René Laloux, particularly in his early stuff, as well as the underrated later classic Gandahar, as well as the nightmarish quality and colour palettes of Valerian Boracek's early stuff. Very inspiring stuff and well worth checking out on YouTube. I also saw some work by Chris Newby, most notably Anchoress. Anchoress is an independent British art film from the 90s, loosely based on true events. It's set in a rural 16th century village community in Surrey and features Christopher Eccleston as a priest who persuades a young woman to be the village Anchoress after she insinuates that she is a conduit for the voice of the Virgin Mary. What does being an Anchoress entail? Well, she gets walled into a very confined concrete extension to the outside of a church, with only a small hole one side to stare at the statue of Mary inside the church, and a small hatch the other side where the village folk can ask for her divine advice and pass her food and drink. She may never leave. It's a film rich in atmosphere and texture. The sound design is hypnotic and evocative. The black and white cinematography is simply gorgeous. Certain painterly compositions invoke and invite comparisons to European masters like Dreyer, Bergman and Tarkovsky, whilst the earthy feel of the film and some of its scenes of isolation reminded me a lot of Japanese classics like Woman of the Dunes and Onibaba at times. There's some great performances too from some great British actors. Eccleston was of course superb, as a somewhat antagonistic presence of the community's priest. Toya Wilcox turns in a brilliant performance too as the Anchoress's headstrong mother who frequently defies Eccleston's priest and his gospel. It was a pleasure to see Pete Postlethwaite too, another great British actor who played one of the more memorable inmates in Alien 3. He plays Toya's husband in this.
An animal falls into an uncovered pit and rots there, then the woman who left the pit uncovered will be guilty before God of the animal's death and be condemned to eternal hell.
Not to forget Natalie Morse as the titular Anchoress, though, who really conveys the youthful innocence, mischievous inquisitiveness and steadfast rebellion fantastically throughout, especially in the scenes of her isolation. This was a great addition to the Severan's All the Haunts We Are's box set, but I'm also glad that I still have the BFI DVD, thanks to its inclusion of Chris Newby's short films, which I looked at after, including an interesting surreal take on The Old Man and the Sea, which incidentally reminded me a lot of Derek Jarman. The Sunday Film Club was a selection of classics that me and my wife watched together. Some I hadn't seen for a very long time, some neither of us had watched. We made a list and decided to work through them in a bit of a random order. We kicked off 2025 by watching The Godfather, due to her having never watched it and me having not seen it in about 15 years, I think on a fuzzy Channel 5 broadcast if I remember. I still remember being very enthralled by it in spite of the bad channel reception ruining the gorgeous cinematography. Both parts were every bit as good as I remembered on a narrative level, and even better than I remembered on a visual one. The editing, the cross-cutting, intelligent framing and general cinematic composition here is sublime. Part 1 is nearly flawless, and serves pretty much as a perfect complete story arc in its own right in my opinion. Those final moments are actually rather chilling. Part 2 is a superb accompaniment to the first film. The idea of cutting between two timelines to serve as both a prequel and a sequel does work wonderfully here, and helps the 200 odd minutes runtime not seem too daunting. Whilst I do appreciate the epic scope of this follow-up, I have to say that I prefer the first film overall, as it was just that little bit tighter and had some more memorable moments. I can certainly see why some people prefer the second film though. We opted not to watch part 3. Next up was The 400 Blows. I had never seen a Truffaut film before, so I decided it was about time I rectified that, especially as I have 15 or so of them on the shelf across a couple Blu-ray box sets. It's easy to see why The 400 Blows is so highly regarded. The down-to-earth filmmaking style works exceedingly well to draw you into Antoine's story. You really feel for the young lad who tries his best in a world of jaded adults, apathetic parents, and authority figures that just don't give a shit. There's some really powerfully crafted moments here of long close-ups of faces that manage to say a lot with very little. I really liked it, and I'll do my best to check out more of Truffaut's stuff next year. I saw Citizen Kane once years ago on BBC 4 on my old CRT TV. I wasn't giving it all that much in the way of attention if I'm being perfectly honest. Well, with a lot more cinema viewing experience under my belt and a bit more of appreciation for filmmaking craft, I gave it another go. It's a pretty good film to be fair, but I feel that it's perhaps a film that I appreciated more than I actually liked. There are some fine moments in it, and it's a very well constructed work, but personally I think Orson Welles made better films later in his career, Touch of Evil in particular, which might just be one of the finest American films of the 50s. I think I have Mark and Jeremy's glowing anecdotal assessment of a play they're forced to sit through in Peep Show to thank for my wife deciding to give Michael Mann's 90s masterpiece Heat a go.
I've got Heat on DVD at home. We're watching this when for less money we could be watching Robert De Niro and Al Pacino.
Shh, I'll call thee Joe.
I'd only watched this once, many years ago, on a train journey via a rip of an ancient non-anamorphic DVD copy, but even in those very suboptimal viewing conditions, I still got hooked into it and was absolutely in awe of its show-stopping post-heist shootout, which might just be one of the finest action set pieces of all time. Of course I watched it on Blu-ray this time around and finally got to really appreciate the visual craftsmanship to back up the film's tight narrative and powerhouse performances by Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, as well as Val Kilmer, who also sadly passed away earlier this year in April. We decided to go for something Hitchcock next, with The Lady Vanishes. I think it's one of Hitchcock's most endearing pre-Hollywood films, possibly the most British film Hitchcock ever made, right down to the classism, excessive tea drinking, repressed homosexuality, amateur sleuthing, and central premise of a mystery concerning the disappearance of a sweet old lady on a steam train. Utterly charming, ludicrous, entertaining, well written, and generally quite funny. We also saw It Couldn't Happen Here, Jack Bond's surreal, quasi-music video satire drama road movie thing about and starring the Pet Shop Boys. It was thoroughly odd at times, but rather excellent on the whole. If you told me that this surreal exercise in capturing the essence of the musical duo's works and inspiration was a long-lost Ken Russell film, and I think I'd almost believe you. There's so much Russell-like charm in the playful mixture of the wild, vivid imagery conjured here and infused with the 80s synth-pop duo's most iconic music, spoken thoughts, lyrics and musings. Not every scene entirely hits well, but the ones that do here are like cinematic fire. My Beautiful Laundrette was another one. I didn't write a review for it at the time of watching it, but I'd easily put it down as one of my favourite new discoveries of the year. I'm a sucker for a British film that perfectly captures the essence of a time and a place, and this 40-year-old film certainly achieves that, as well as being a sharply written, funny, sad, daring and thoroughly engaging piece of cinema that juggles several important themes without ever losing sight of itself. Gordon Warneck and Daniel Day-Lewis have such magnificent chemistry here too.
Oh, one thing more. Try and fix him up with a nice girl. I'm not sure his penis is in full working order.
What are you doing, boy?
It'll be going into profit any day now. Partly because I've hired a bloke of astounding competence and strength of body and mind to look after it.